What's up, friends? Take a look. Yes, I am not in my usual studio, aka my guest bedroom. I am in a real studio doing an in-person conversation. This is the first one we've ever done in the history of the New Evangelicals. First, I want to thank all of our donors who made this possible. We are a nonprofit organization, and as part of our expansion of content called Project Amplify, we want to do more in-person conversations with credible voices, helping us navigate a better path forward in our faith. So today, on this episode of TNE Talks, I brought on my friend Shane Claiborne. He's an author, an activist. He is honestly... he's a legend. There's no way around it. If you know Shane's work, he has been around for a long time doing amazing things. And honestly, we do not hold back in this conversation. We talk about Israel, Gaza. We talk about politics. We talk about the death penalty, about gun control, and ways that Christianity has failed, but also ways that Christians can do better as we fight for a more inclusive and humanizing approach to all of these conversations that impact so many people around us. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I'll talk to you all soon. Do you find it interesting or difficult when you hear people try and justify like why we need more guns in the country, or why as Christians we have to take up arms because of, well, Jesus told his disciples to have a sword? Like you probably hear that a lot, and yet part of your job is melting down guns and turning them into literal plowshares. How do you navigate some of that theology?
One of the trickier parts of that, it's like a facet of that, is the idea that like evil is a new thing, right?
Yeah, right. Right.
Like, what did Jesus know about Hamas? You're like,
Right.
They were actually feeding Christians to beasts in the gladiatorial games.
Right.
They were hanging people upside down on crosses. Like, I think when he said love your enemy, like he knew that there were real violent forces. I think that's the part. It's like finding Jesus to be out of touch. That really is one of the more difficult things. Same with Dr. King. You're like, the idea of nonviolence is so kind of idealistic, or you don't really understand the real world. And you're like,
yes,
Dr. King got rid of his guns after someone threw a homemade bomb at his house, and was just like, that's evil, and I can't mirror that. You know, I mean, that's deep. It's deep, though, right?
Yeah.
Like, and then he still gets killed. So is that failure? Like,
right.
He,
Right. Well, I
mean, but that's where people want to retell the story, right? Well, if Jesus had an AR-15, you know,
right.
You're like, really? Like that's, I think, where it really does get into idolatry and remaking Jesus into this lover of guns and weaponry and going to come back and make some heads roll, I mean,
Lauren Boebert said that, right? She was the one who said, like, if only he had a firearm.
Yeah, there's so many folks that have had that, that kind of ideology.
Right.
But that's exactly what she said.
Right. And I saw that and went, now, again, I don't want to put words in Lauren's mouth, but she's someone who, as far as I know, would say, like, I take the Bible seriously. I'm standing on God's word. And then when it comes to loving your enemy, or the clear nonviolent ethic we see in the 4 different gospel accounts, suddenly she goes, well, if only he had an AR-15 and maybe the results would be different. Like, maybe she's thinking this is kind of a joke, but also it reveals a much deeper reality for people in those spaces who, for some reason, seem to have no problem claiming the way of Christ, but also thinking, well, if only we had more access to guns and killing machines, and also if we killed more criminals, America or our society would be a more Christ-like place.
Yeah. And it's also interesting who claps and says amen, because it's not just about folks with this off-the-wall theology of violence, but it's the folks that follow them too, and that can try to kind of reconcile these irreconcilable things. You know what I mean? Like
100%.
I think even a lot of the scholars though that look at Barabbas, the other person that was facing execution, and why the crowd chose that, which, a lot of folks think was a violent version of a messianic kind of revolution,
Right.
over the nonviolence of Jesus. I mean, I kind of get it. I kind of get how that logic is, there's gravity towards that idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you've done a decade or two of work now, boots on the ground, right, in Philadelphia and really around the world, doing your best, I would say, to emulate the way of Christ and to fight violence everywhere with nonviolence approaches and by protesting, etc. I mean, as you reflect on your own life and legacy of what you've done, have you found that there are a lot of Christians out there who are like, yes, like, what are we doing? Or do you find that you hear more and more Christians who are willing to resort to violence or to other means to either protect themselves or the country or whatever issue that they're standing on?
Well, I think the devil is a liar. But he also, kind of, those same lies kind of keep just sort of having new, fresh iterations. And I mean, I think when it comes to violence, for hundreds of years, we've tried to find ways to justify violence,
Yeah.
And I mean, I even think of Gandhi, this champion for nonviolence. But he said, if I have to choose between a coward and a soldier, I'll choose a soldier any day, because that passion, the courage can be channeled into nonviolence. Like you can do something with that, but it's hard to do anything with a coward, And so I think of that, and Jesus having zealots on board. So I think there's something to the passion, the fervor, even the idea I want to rid the world of evil. Some of these are actually legitimate pursuits. The question is that really our job to do, or God's? And how do you rid the world of evil without becoming evil? Those are the questions. So I think those are old questions, but they're fresh ones. The other thing I think is that there's a lot of ways that people justify violence that they would never allow an individual to do, but they give a blank check to the state to do in sort of a vague sense, using Romans or whatever,
Romans 13.
What's happening right now, in Gaza, as you go, Israel can do no wrong. No, actually, Israel can do wrong. In fact, if you read the Bible, they've done good and wrong, and sometimes both at the same time, and God's judgments, all, so there's, but same with the U.S., it's as if we and then you look at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and you have to kind of create ways of creating your own mythology around it, or your own justification. But it keeps on going, right? Right now, the way that, how can you defend our nuclear arsenal of 50,000 Hiroshima bombs?
Right.
Should we even have one?
Right.
Even to reframe it, should anyone who claims to follow Jesus have a bomb that can blow up 100,000 people?
Right. Right.
Much less 50,000 of those.
Yeah.
Right. So those are that's why I think it's so baffling, especially for folks that are looking on, and I mean, even folks like Russell Moore have said that people used to reject the doctrines of the Christian faith. I don't really think Jesus rose from the dead or whatever, but now folks are rejecting Christianity because they think Christians don't actually believe their own ideology.
Right. Yeah. No, for sure.
It's an interesting point,
I would imagine maybe critics of yours or of my perspective would say, well, there's the ethereal or the metaphysical idea of nonviolence or not being armed. Then there's the pragmatic reality, right? That, hey, there are people out there in the world who want to do maybe bad things to people in different countries, and other countries have nuclear weapons, and maybe it's a show of how big our sword is that kind of deters more violence from happening. And, I talk to you about this a lot, Shane. I am a very pragmatic person naturally. I tend to think about how do we get things done? And when it comes to boots on the ground type of talk, what do we got to do to make things more peaceful, et cetera? So I'm kind of curious how you respond to that, because I can see how someone could say that, and they could say, look, yes, you're right, Shane. The U.S. has many nuclear warheads that could, destroy the world many times over. And it's that show of force that keeps everything else in check from other people not being destroyed or keeping people at home in America safe. Do you wrestle between like the call of the individual Christian versus the call of how Christians advocate for things in public policy? Like, what do you think about that when it comes to violence and use of force?
I'm one that really believes that our means has to reflect our end. We're not going to magically arrive at a world free of violence by killing each other to get there, you know? And I mean, look at our guns. Like, I think the bombs are sort of a next level of the guns, but you think if guns made us safer, we would be the safest country in the world. You know, we got more guns than people. And we have an unfathomable amount of lives lost every day, every year to guns, you know? So it's sort of that, I think that's a part of the facade, right? Is that this is going to make it safer. Now, I have even a different expectation of folks who would claim Christian faith, right? Folks that their moral compass is Jesus. Their guide for living is the Sermon on the Mount. And this idea of loving your enemy, of you live by the sword, you'll die by the sword. What good is it to gain the whole world and lose your soul? I mean, it's all there, right?
Right. Yes, that's true. The Bible is clear.
So I kind of feel like the question's kind of like not just what's effective, but what's faithful. And I really think that you can argue that violence has worked and violence has failed, that, you know, this is one way of keeping the world safe. This is another way. And honestly, there's a deeper question, which is, what does the way of Jesus look like? Like, what does it look like to try to build the kind of world that God wants? And that you know, that's kind of the guiding question. And it's part of why I find it so problematic when it's fellow Christians that are often the force behind the violence or blessing the bombs or, you know, arming themselves. Christians owning guns at a higher rate than the general population. These are problematic realities.
Honestly, I think I wrestle the most with violence, and when it's appropriate, when it comes to oppressed groups who are living underneath the thumb of oppressors, so to speak. I mean, I think about James Cone in this case, right? Where he says, like, how long does the boot have to be on the neck via violence before a rejection of that boot on the neck is justifiable? And he was referring to how in America at the time of that writing, how people had no problem with state-sanctioned violence. And then when those people who were underneath the boot of that pushed back violently, suddenly it was too far and it was all wrong. And I struggle because I feel like as a white man in America, it's not really my call to tell people who have a whole different understanding and experience of the world that they occupy, sorry, you can't respond that way because of this Jesus ethic. But at the same time, I do wrestle with, for Christians, what does it mean for us to be faithful to Jesus in times where I can see the justification for it, even though there is a call to love our enemy, you know, and be nonviolent?
I mean, certainly we've kind of all got a social location, you know, and that we're kind of looking at the world through. And, you know, I think of that old saying, like, where we sit determines what we see, you know, and yet I think what's interesting is that some of my deepest conviction around nonviolence, some of the people that have shaped my theology have been folks that have had a different social location. They've actually suffered the brunt of the violence of empire, of colonization. I think right now of so many of our friends in the West Bank that are Palestinian Christian theologians that have this ethic of nonviolence that is still there. I mean, it's in the letter that they wrote to the Western Church. It's in so many different places. And you look at it, and it's centered around Jesus.
Yeah.
And it's also centered around the idea that nonviolence and love is the only way forward. It's the only way that you heal the wounds of violence. It's the only way that you neutralize the enemy without becoming a part of the apparatus of death. And that has so much credibility and so much integrity because it is coming from people who have been oppressed by the contemporary empire. But they're getting that from hundreds of years old of theology that's been
Yeah.
passed down. And you look at like whereas Christianity actually come to power and had the weapons and the capacity to either try to preserve the peace or make the peace, and it's been disastrous.
Right.
Everywhere.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
from Constantine until today, wherever Christians have had the power to hurt others, we've done it, you know, and
Yeah.
it really literally is living into that, the idea of Jesus that what good is it to gain the whole world and lose your soul? Like we really do lose our soul when we begin to become a part of the entanglements of power and to take on the role of God, right? To rid the world
Yeah.
of evil, all this stuff.
Right.
Like noble aspirations that are not ours to aspire to. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and we can see how violence begets violence, right? Like, my friend Daniel Bonanora, who's a Christian Palestinian, and he grew up in Bethlehem. I've had him on the podcast before. He does amazing work. Like to your point, committed to nonviolence and also committed to the liberation of the Palestinian people. And he said, this is what's happening right now is one of the best recruiting campaigns
Yeah.
for Hamas when it comes to the radicalization and potentially responding with more violence. Because, and it makes complete sense. I mean, if we're in Philadelphia right now, right? Mm-hmm. If we were experiencing nonstop bombing, if our friends were dying, if my parents were being killed by an occupying force, that would change, or I would be very tempted to respond, right, in a way that said, no more. I want to respond with more violence. If my kids grew up without a dad, I could see how that could easily radicalize them. So I do agree with you that I don't think more violence is the answer to any of this stuff, because as we've seen, especially on the global stage, whether it's Iraq, Afghanistan, or what's happening here, it's not going to solve the problem, right? You're not going to eradicate, quote unquote, extremism by being extreme with violent tactics and just, decimating entire cities and populations.
Yeah. I mean, some of that I really became even more deeply convinced of when I was in Iraq, during the bombing in 2003. And I met soldiers that said, I went to Iraq because I wanted to get rid of terrorism. And I discovered that we're creating it, that we're fueling this. And that, and I went to places like the Amaria shelter, which was, most Americans don't even know about, but it was filled with women and children in Iraq when the U.S. hit it with 2 smart bombs, and it incinerated. They didn't even allow men in the shelter to make sure the kids and women were safe. And it was hit with these 2 bombs that just killed everybody. And when I went there, you could still see, it's sickening. I mean, you could see the shadow from the light that burnt the images onto the wall.
Oh my gosh.
And you could see like what happened in there. And you walk away from that and you see, Dr. King said, they must find us to be strange liberators. Because you go, wow. This is not liberation. This is terror. Like the exact same thing that we say that we are against.
Right.
We have become, and that I think that's a real. And I don't know if I ever told you this, but when I was there, I was in the car and my friend said, we passed by the U.S. military base. And my friend, who was also translating, he spoke Arabic, and he said, do you know what we call that in Arabic? And I said, no. And he said, Al-Qaeda. And I was like, ooh, I kind of thought it was a little dark joke, or something. And he's like, literally, Al-Qaeda means the base. So without joking at all, like what we would call the U.S. military base in Arabic is exactly what you all would call the extremists. And he said, I'll leave it there. But basically what he said after that is, we have been hurting and we have 2 enemies, your government and our government.
Wow.
And so when the people are just suffering, you begin to go, it doesn't matter who's killing your kids.
Yeah.
That feels like terrorism, to this idea of what's going to create a better world, a more beautiful world. I think there's an entire argument to be made especially as a Christian, but even not, of like, what does end the hostilities? Even if, like, I think in our neighborhood, or even of someone that you don't like, right?
Yep, totally.
I mean, there's even psychologists that show like it actually does really good things to our soul when we treat someone who doesn't like us nicely. Like it's not just about converting them, but it's about who we are too. So I think that's all very interesting and not just theoretical. Like it has real life ramifications. Yeah.
One of the moments that got me to start rethinking my understanding of America, what it is as a country, always being on the right side of everything, was honestly your book, Irresistible Revolution, that you wrote a long time ago now.
Blushing over here.
It's true though. I was in Germany on a missions trip. I was 3 months overseas in Germany, Finland, and Belgium. I had a copy of your book and I read it. And I mean, I had to be 18 or 19. I was still very much in the evangelical world, but it was the first time where I thought, I never really thought about I never thought about the military complex, or us and as Americans and how we're treating other countries, or the financial system, et cetera. And I think that perhaps there's several illusions that I think happen in evangelical Christianity as I grew up in it. But one of them is this belief that like America is always the greatest country on earth, always promoting democracy and freedom everywhere else. And then you start realizing how big the military budget is. And you realize how we are the largest exporter of arms globally, and how many companies like Lockheed Martin make a lot of money off of that. And then all of a sudden, what becomes in your head at first is this great country that's always fighting for freedom and righteousness and truth becomes a little more murky when you realize that we're kind of, in many examples of history, funding both sides of the war. Or we're destabilizing other countries for our own benefit, or we're selling people who want to do ill will to other people massive amounts of weapons. Yeah. Talk to me about that. I mean, you are someone who is at the cutting edge of this. You know what's going on. Give us some of the details here.
Well, first, just to rewind a little bit, it's really fun that we're friends now.
It is.
Hanging out. And it does make me blush a little bit every time you talk about the book. But I mean, I love it, man. I think it's incredible that we're doing this work together these days. And hanging out and whatnot, having fake coffee.
Yeah. Don't ruin it, Shane. Okay. This is all real. Nothing is staged.
Yeah, but so, I mean, it does feel like true to say that America has always been a bit of a paradox. Like there's this paradoxical nature to it. And Eddie Glaude and so many folks have pointed that out, that America's not unique in her sins when it comes to like slaughtering native peoples and enslaving Africans, selling human beings as property. But where we are unique is in the mythology that we've made up to kind of justify or remember history a certain way, manifest destiny, the theology, the ways that we've come to wrap this in religious language and I've come to use this word, bro, spiritual entitlement. Like literally that there's this sense that like really God wanted us, like we're actually better caretakers of this land than the natives. Like God wanted us to have this land.
Yes.
And so that we could convert the pagan, Native Americans to Jesus. And so all that like is really, really poisonous theology, but it is theology. And a part of that root is the way that we've, even the founding documents, right? Where we said, all men are created equal. And you're like, and that's those same documents we called Native Americans savages. We called, black folks 3/5 human. Like the people that wrote that document were selling human beings and owning them as property. So like that paradox is there, right?
Women couldn't vote. They had no rights, et cetera. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's where, this christening of America, where you put in God we trust on money, you try to put the 10 Commandments in the public school. That's where it really becomes a crisis, where you go, actually, this is literally taking the Lord's name in vain, right? Like when we put in God we trust on our economy, and it looks like the 7 deadly sins, Totally. And many theologians said what it does is it inoculates you, like that's what a vaccine does, a watered down version of the disease knocks it out of your system. I think there's sort of this nationalistic version of Christianity that people go, I don't want any part of that, right? And they think they rejected Christianity, but they just rejected American nationalism.
100%.
So but when it comes to violence, I mean, that's one of our. It's hard to imagine America without guns. I mean, how would you build a country with stolen labor on stolen land? Like,
right. Right.
And even now, when Dr. King, 50 or so years ago, began to speak out against the violence of America, I mean, he was very comprehensive in naming that. And he called the United States the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. And he said, we tell our young people not to use violence, but then our government uses it all the time.
Right.
So
right.
Like, every time our government goes to war, we teach our kids violence can solve their problems. So he really began to, be such a powerful voice on that. But you look at from our proliferation of guns, I mean, we're the biggest owner of guns. We got 5% of the world's population and half the world's guns.
Right.
We're producing one gun every 3 seconds. We're arming the world. But then you look at the big guns, the bombs, right?
Right.
And it's companies like Lockheed Martin that, last I checked, it was like 150 countries have had arms contracts with U.S. manufacturers like Lockheed Martin, weapons contractors. Wow. I mean, that's literally, most of the world is getting weaponry, and then they're killing each other. And we're surprised. It's like if I was selling guns in my neighborhood and upset when kids get killed.
Right, right. No,
this
totally.
is messed up.
Totally.
And there's times that we know that we were arming both parties. The Iran-Contra scandal, where you're like, we're going to arm you and make a killing, literally.
Right.
Or
right
so
now.
Messed up. Right now.
Right now we are funding Israel's bombing of the Gaza Strip, and we're also sending aid to people in Gaza, trying to feeding them by dropping parachutes of food. Yeah. It's like, but we're doing both of that. It's just when you look at that and you realize that this is happening, you go, wait, what if we just stopped funding these people who were bombing children?
Yeah,
and use some of the weight of the U.S. is the weight of our power, I guess, to say, actually, no, you have to stop doing this, and we have to figure this out, because not just one, and of course, every life is sacred and matters, right? We have 30,000 plus people now, most of which are civilians. In fact, going back to my friend Daniel, he said that there are people there who are dying of things that aren't even being counted. Like, he knew someone who needed dialysis but couldn't get it anymore because the health infrastructure in Gaza is totally destroyed.
Insulin,
right? Exactly.
Absolutely.
Those are not counted as war casualties. So his estimation is that the casualties are even higher than what we know them to be because of how people are dying. Now, there's a huge famine problem. People are dying of preventable diseases, right?
Yeah, and folks have, said it's even, to be more accurate than famine even, is say forced starvation, right? Because you think of famine like in sub-Saharan Africa, this is actually forced starvation and the collective punishment of people. That should always be wrong.
Yeah.
It's wrong to kill Israeli citizens because of what their government's doing. It's wrong to kill Palestinians because of what Hamas has done.
Right.
And that's where you start to go, even someone who thinks that this is about Hamas, right?
Right.
A couple of things I would say is, one is, how many children have to die in Gaza to atone for the sins of Hamas on October 7th? Right? How many? Literally. You have to begin to go, we're now over 13,000, and there's 8,000 missing. So we don't even know the accurate numbers, but we know it's way too many, right? Every single one of those made in the image of God. And then I think there's also the question of Hamas is not our moral compass, right?
Right. Yeah.
We don't lower our morality because of what they've done,
Right.
I mean, our parents taught us, no, two wrongs don't make a right. I don't change my ethics because someone else mistreats me, you know? And so all the more in this situation where so many lives are at stake, we don't say, well, look what Hamas did, so we're going to kill babies too.
Totally. Totally.
So messed up, no matter what flag you wrap it in, no matter what kind of theology you try to use to justify it. I think that's the other thing too, that God is getting thrown around in all of this.
Totally.
You know, and that's one of the things.
Totally.
The lives lost break my heart, but it also this idea that we see over and over and again, no one kills with more passion and more conviction than when they believe that God has their back.
Yep.
It's true of almost every faith that's been distorted and twisted to do horrific violence and say it's God's will.
Yeah, I think a lot about, people often think that I'm just angry at the church or that I'm not a Christian anymore. But if I wasn't a Christian, I wouldn't be doing this work. I care deeply about the Christian faith, especially the one that I say radicalized me to be a Jesus follower. I care about how the evangelical tradition in America is talking and handling these issues and what side they're falling on of various conversations. And when I see Christian, mostly evangelical politicians say things like, they don't care if kids are dying. They should all be killed, as one politician said, or we should treat this like we did with Japan, hinting at dropping a nuclear bomb on Gaza. I think to myself, what has gone wrong? Like these are not, and I want to be so clear here, Shane. These are not, hey, I'm wrestling through, my perspective on how to understand this situation happening. These are people saying bombastic, extreme things that are ridiculous. I mean, you're really suggesting, and you're a lawmaker, that you would be open to dropping a nuclear bomb on Gaza, and you're a Christian? When someone asked you about the children, you said, kill them all. It's no big deal. Like they deserve it. This is not a pro-life ethic from womb to tomb, as you like to say. This is not a Christian ethic. This is not an ethic of humanization. This is not an ethic of as Christians believing that every human is made in the imago Dei and is worthy of dignity and respect and flourishing.
Preaching now, man.
I'm sorry, you got me going, but I'm just saying, like, it is maddening to me that in 2024 in America, in the tradition that raised me, these are the things that people are saying, or they have a really unhealthy Christian Zionist attitude. And to be clear to the audience, that's not an anti-Semitic statement, okay? Because I grew up in this world that thought if you critique Israel, you're automatically anti-Semitic. That is not what that is at all. But there is a deeply embedded theological and eschatological view that is both, might I add, actually anti-Semitic, okay, and also is killing people in Palestine. I mean, John Hagee is a good example of this. John Hagee really believes that for Christ to come back, like 2/3 of Jewish people need to die in Israel. That there's going to be a huge slaughter, or that somehow they need to convert to Christianity. That is not pro-Jewish. That is really unhealthy.
Yeah, and John Hagee has been one of those voices that has built the kind of way for the kind of violence that we see right now through the theological constructs, the kind of tarmac of where we are now. And I was trying to listen the other day to just understand someone's theological constructs. And he's talking about this text in Ezekiel about Gog, Gog and Magog, and this is the eschatological end war, and what I notice is in the entire segment, he doesn't mention the name of Jesus a single time. He's got this text that he's obsessed with from Ezekiel and thinks this is a part of that prophetic, end times thing. And you go, in the end, like this stuff was happening for Jesus too. Like that's why I look at like the Gospels, and it's very interesting that the temptations that Jesus faced in the desert were very real.
Right.
Like so relevant.
Right.
And there's one version, I don't know if you see this, but it said, you might be a Christian nationalist if you believe that Jesus made the wrong decisions in the desert temptations. Literally, like, you're like, we're making, why didn't you just accept the power? Why didn't you turn stones into bread? Why didn't you fling yourself from the, like, these are
why didn't you
literally
kiss the ring?
The same temptations that we face, and we think Jesus made the wrong choice, right?
Totally.
So, but like his disciples, they wanted to call down fire from heaven. Literally, that's what the gospel says, right? They wanted to call down fire from heaven on the Samaritans, and Jesus absolutely rebukes them.
Yeah.
Like they want to use violence even after walking with Jesus his entire, life. Peter still picks up the sword and wounds a man in
Right.
defense of Jesus.
Right.
And Jesus rebukes Peter
Yep.
and heals the guy that he wounded, right?
Yeah.
So all of this is a confrontation of the real violence that tempts us.
Yeah.
And so like when I look at that now and you go like, this is still one of the other things you see in the gospel is that Jesus' harshest words were not for people at the fringes of the faith,
Right.
but is for people that were distorting the faith, people that were at the very center of the religious power structures, the theologians, the teachers of the law, right?
Right.
And he says to them, I mean, I don't know how I missed it in Sunday school, but he says to them like, you travel across land and sea to make a single convert, and then you make them twice the sons of hell that you are.
Right. That's intense language.
Like you're literally making a convert and then they become hellish people
Right.
in the world,
Right.
right? Like
Right.
Jesus saying the tax collectors and the prostitutes are entering the kingdom ahead of you. Literally the people that you've shunned and marginalized are ahead of you. So, that should teach us something. It should tell us
Yeah.
something, right?
Yeah.
Like our orientation and even our theology. If our theology gets in the way of love, if it bears violent fruit, then
Right.
it's messed up theology, right?
Right.
Barbara Brown Taylor saying like,
Yes.
when I have to choose between loving my theology or my religion and loving my neighbor, I'm going to choose loving my neighbor because Jesus never called me to love my theology. And so if that theology doesn't look like love, if it doesn't sound like love, if it doesn't manifest itself in love, and this is like, there's still questions to be resolved, right?
Sure.
What does it look like to love our enemy? I mean, when scripture even says, if your enemy is hungry, feed them.
Right.
If your enemy is thirsty, give them something to drink.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think the children and the families in Gaza are the enemy. Even if you believe Hamas is the enemy.
Right.
And you're called like,
Right.
I mean,
Right.
So let's wrestle with that,
Yeah.
right? But there's no way that you can justify the kind of violence that we see, I think, especially as a Christian. You know, there's questions that we can ask. There's things that you can say, I don't know, but there's no way that you can say bombing refugee camps, forcing children to starve, like sanctioning medication from coming in, having like doctors deliver babies with cell phone. Like, this is messed up.
It's
messed up.
It's messed up. And, look, I mean, you and I were talking about this a little bit earlier before we started recording, but we have to be able to hold Biden accountable for some of this stuff. Like I think that sometimes in the circles I exist in nowadays, right, I can see people kind of minimize when maybe their preferred presidential nominee, does something and they don't want to really call it out. But Biden has not been good on this issue at all.Maybe his words have been nice, but the actions have said something totally different. And I feel like with this particular election we're walking into, a lot of people there's several different major views I hear on how people are approaching how they think about Biden or Trump and how they think about this issue and how that all plays into it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because it's interesting because I kind of see there's like three different, honestly, Shane, I mean, there's like 3 or 4 different takes I see. You and I were recently at a rally together. And I forgot her name. Who was the woman who spoke? She's a Muslim woman.
Linda Sarsour.
Yeah. And she pretty much just said it. She's like, Biden is funding a genocide. I cannot give my support to Biden. I don't care about Trump. I'm not going to do it. I was like, whoa. And her perspective was, we as marginalized folks have been here before in American history. So I don't care. And I thought to myself, I have never heard that perspective. I have some other friends who are in similar spaces who have told me the same thing. And I'm like, okay. And then I think that there are other people who are like, well, listen, Trump and Biden, let's just say for sake of argument, they're equally as bad on this topic. Some might say, well, one threatens democracy and one at least will give us a survivable 4 years of maintaining democracy, right? And then I think pragmatically on my end, and of course, I'm not endorsing any one candidate over the other or telling people how to vote, But I think about like the pragmatic of this, you know, like, yeah, because we do have the threat of Christian nationalism. I feel like it really is a serious threat in our current cultural moment. Things like Project 2025, they're very clear with what they want to do. Trump makes jokes that he only be a dictator on day one. Okay, that's kind of concerning, you know, and people who are in his base seem to be okay with that. And then we have Joe Biden, and I'm like, well, you know, at least the guy at least says he wants to protect democracy in some way, shape, or form. But also, we just passed a spending bill that funded more funded more weaponry to Israel.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what are we doing, right? Like, this is a bad look. And so I think as a Christian, and I know you wrote a book on this, Jesus for President. You wrote it a couple of years back now. But I just wrestle with my own pragmatism versus my own ethics that I want to be aligned with when it comes to the way of Jesus.
Yeah. Ooh, well.
Thoughts, Shane?
Yeah, I got some thoughts. I got a few. I mean, when we wrote Jesus for President, one of the things that we were wrestling with, genuinely, was what is a faithful posture for Christians when it comes to politics, you know? And these very imperfect decisions we make when we vote for candidates and we vote, you know? So we're reading all these books. We're drawing from the rich well of Christian anarchism and you know, Anabaptists and the folks that really find our citizenship is not in this world, but you know, all that stuff. Like there's some gems there, right? And some bones to spit out here and there. But sure. So and then, you know, as you spend time with folks who come from a lineage of oppressed people, from ancestors that were enslaved, and you see how important fighting for rights and voting and things like that has been. I mean, in one sense, it is about recognizing and celebrating the image of God in another person, right? In every person.
Yeah, totally.
And by saying you don't vote, we might be like, well, who cares? Like, I'm a citizen of heaven. You're like, that's actually dehumanizing, right? And like to say you can't swim in this swimming pool, that's not just about a political issue, right? It's about a spiritual crisis and a fundamentally like a ungodly like way of treating another human being made in the image of God, right? So all that. So, but I think the big challenge whenever people engage politically is to misplace our hope and to put our hope in a person or a party as if they were going to solve all the problems, you know, that they're this messianic force. It's, and that's why it's always felt very inauthentic for me to endorse a candidate or a party. Like I've never done that. I've always said, I see the values and the priorities of Jesus. When I was sick, did you take care of me? Like, what does that mean about healthcare? You know, when I was hungry, did you give me something to eat? You know, like all of these things that, I mean, these have real life implications when it comes to food stamps. I don't think that like politicians are exempt from, as if they're in some other sphere, that they don't have to care about those that Jesus called the least of these. In fact, that's what I'm voting for. When I vote, I'm voting for the least of these, the most vulnerable, the poor, what does it look like to use our voice for immigrants and asylum seekers? So that's how I sort of think of it, is that, and I've also kind of been, you know, gotten in a little debate with some folks over the idea that voting is damage control. But I really do think that one way of thinking of voting is that it's harm reduction, that we're voting for the person that we think will do the least amount of damage in the world, that we're trying to harness the principalities and powers that are destroying people's lives. That becomes really hard, though, when you see two people that are both going to increase the military budget.
Right. Yeah, I mean,
one
Biden,
by maybe a few $1 billion less. You know?
I mean, Biden increased it. You know, like
Biden increased Trump's military budget. Trump increased the budget before him and the budget before. So they're
one-upping themselves in the worst possible way.
This is a commander-in-chief of the biggest military complex in the world. So can someone who's a follower of the Prince of Peace, like, how do you interact with that? I think those are exactly the right questions. You know, and you know, right now, I think you point out a really important thing is that on a couple of fronts, those of us that care about life and the dignity of every person, the Biden administration is problematic. the way that he's navigated the genocide in Gaza, the escalation of the violence,
Yep.
the ability to grieve the lives lost in Israel on October 7th, like all of us did, with passion and without
100%.
hesitation.
Yep.
But the inability to really name and grieve the lives lost in Gaza and to call for a ceasefire. I mean, the fact that it's just shameful that we are the ones that have vetoed a resolution or even abstained, as if that's worth celebrating to
Right.
allow, like this is
Right.
like to think
We're the
that
only country. We stand alone here.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is a moral failure, right?
Yes. Yes.
And to say that Trump would be more of a failure, like feels a little like, is that, what does that mean, right?
Is that really the standard here?
Yeah. So, I mean, I get
yeah.
it. I get why people are upset. I get why, like young people are in the streets and like
Right.
why the Atlantic wrote an article saying, how will young people change Washington when they hate it so much? Like
Right.
they're so dissatisfied
Totally.
with politicians that can't get anything done on
Yeah.
guns.
Yeah.
I mean, I was there at the White House when we celebrated the most robust gun laws in 30 years. And I mean, like, when I heard what the law, I'm like, it doesn't even
Bravo.
have a ban on assault weapons. You know what I
Right,
mean? Like,
right.
So, like the
Yeah.
bar is so low. And Biden on the death penalty, right?
Yes.
He has flipped. He is against the death penalty, but he was for the death penalty. In fact, his prior legislation built up the federal death penalty and expanded death penalty worthy crimes
Wow.
to new charges, right? That someone be eligible for the federal death penalty. So all we're asking him to do is to tear down the execution chamber
Right.
and tear hope. And everybody to the top levels of his administration said it's a very reasonable ask that he could do that by executive order, right? To just tear down a building that is designed for one purpose, which is to kill people
Yeah.
at a federal level. And thankfully, Biden hasn't killed anyone there, but Trump did, and I think the next president could, So let's tear it down, right?
Yeah.
Like if you're really against the death penalty,
Yeah.
dismantle the machinery of death, and you can do it while
Yeah.
you're president. So I think those disappointments add up. And the tricky thing on the two-party deal, right, is that you end up going, well, they're not as bad as them, right? And what ends up
Totally.
happening all the
Totally.
time is we end up taking, I think, we emphasize the best of whoever our people are, and we pit it against the worst of the other group.
Yeah.
And I think there's something actually very powerful about Jesus saying, get the log out of your own eye. When we can name the contradictions in our own political affiliation,
Yeah.
like it does something, right? Even
Yeah.
like on guns. One of our best allies right now is gun owners against assault weapons.
Yes.
Hunters concerned about gun violence. And we've got to build those kind of coalitions, so it comes to the point where my ideologies are not going to get in the way of progress and of working with people who I might not agree with on everything. And
Yes.
it's that self-righteousness that can infect progressive circles and prevent change from happening, just like it can on the right. It's poisonous.
I totally agree. I was literally a few weeks ago at this event called Exiles in Babylon, hosted by Preston Sprinkle. Okay, and if anyone knows his work, he's someone who is not affirming. He does a lot of work in like the traditional sexual ethics space, but he's someone who would like use pronouns. He respects the rights of people, etc. And he invited me to speak on this panel about deconstruction, reconstruction, and the gospel in front of about 1,000 people. And I talked to my board, talked to some friends of mine who I respect, and I did it. And my thought was, if I can work with them to lower the temperature, right, of when it comes to the rhetoric that we see that's so dehumanizing towards my queer neighbor, I will do that. If I have a chance to speak for 15 minutes in front of a largely evangelical crowd and give them not only my story, but represent the story of thousands of people when it comes to why they deconstruct, I'm going to do that. And you know what? Me, Preston, many others who were there, we were up till almost 1 o'clock in the morning one night just talking and wrestling, and we had so much common ground that hopefully would help make the world a better place. And I agree, and it's not everyone's job. There are people who are like, listen, Tim, I get it. You do what you got to do. I high five you from afar, but those places are not safe for me. They're not built for me. I totally get that. But I do think, especially people like us, Shane, who were kind of formed by some of this stuff and really have a lot of ability to move through this world pretty effortlessly. We're kind of bilingual in that sense, We can speak that language, we understand how the culture works, and we can communicate in a way that I think is compelling to those folks and try and find some common ground. I just feel like we have a real sense of obligation to do all we can from every angle, whether it is protesting and getting arrested at Lockheed Martin, which you do, right? Or going to some of these other spaces and saying, how can we work together? How can we be made aware of the issues that we're facing and the people that are suffering on behalf of them, and think about these things in a more holistic way, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's so important. The other thing I wanted to mention that you were talking about that I think we have to call out is, it is infuriating to me that we have this two-party system where it seems like the only thing they both agree on behind closed doors is, well, just us and no more, right? I mean, people forget this.
Yeah.
People don't realize that the DNC, Democratic, I think that's what it is, National Committee or Convention, and the RNC, the Republican National Convention, they are not government entities. They're not owned by the government. They are, as far as I know, are 501c4s. Like, they are nonprofit organizations, which is why they're always fundraising money. You know, they don't have some connection directly to the government, and they own the election process in America, whether setting the rules on of who could be featured on TV during debates, or what third parties are going to be shunned really quickly, et cetera.
Yo, you're making everybody mad right now. Yeah.
I know. I'm an equal opportunity offender, I guess, But I just think that we have to realize this stuff. Like, this is not necessarily normal.
Yes. That's exactly. I think that's a really good word. Is like, it doesn't have to be this way, right? And I think that sometimes our biggest obstacle to progress is the limits we put around our imagination, right? You look around the world. There are countries that have like 5 parties, 10 parties, 15 parties. Right? There are countries that actually don't elect a person; they elect a platform, right? Yeah. And then that group appoints the person that best fits that platform, right? Like, crazy ideas, right? Like, there are lots of countries that look on us and how we've created, I mean, all kinds of the rugged individualism, the celebrity culture. So that's how you end up with a reality TV star, serial abuser becoming the president of the United States, right? And so, like, I saw at one of the protests, I saw a sign that said, we've taken the idea of anybody can be president a little too seriously. But that's how you get here, right?
Totally.
So that idea of like, what would America look like if we had that kind of options? And there's people that are working on that at a statewide level, ranked choice voting, all this stuff. Like, let's create ways where it really is a popular vote that elects people, so crazy, But, so I think that that polarization, I mean, also it's really dangerous. The folks that study democracies, I was just on this call, bro, like one of those Zoom calls.
Oh, tell me everything.
The mini Zoom calls.
Yeah.
But this was one that people have studied over ages and ages, generations, and all over the globe, democracies in crisis, and they kind of name the lights on the radar. These are some things that you
some of the
for.
warning signs.
Yeah, warning signs. And dude,
I
ain't trying to be an alarmist, but
oh no, this is not a talk radio show.
Yeah, I know.
But,
I mean, this is leading up to like civil wars and stuff. So like, we're not going to have that.
Of course not.
But
no,
I mean, one of them is armed citizenry. Where you can't have a civil war if you don't have. I mean, you actually can't have a violent revolution like in the Rwandan genocide, but like usually it happens when people are armed, right?
Yeah.
Like with guns. We got a lot of guns, right?
Yeah.
And so then it was they went through all these different ones, but one of them is limited options. Like the fewer political parties and options you have, the more polarized you are. And then you look at now, like people mistrusting truth, like having different versions of truth, not trusting the voting process or like media, all that stuff. Like these are every one of them.
The board's lighting up.
The only one we didn't have from these experts was a catalytic event. So often there's an assassination or
An insurrection?
Imagine, someone refusing to leave off, but those create that kind of galvanizing event. So that's alarming. I mean, I'm not trying to, but I'm just saying, like, I think that our democracy is in crisis.
Look, I don't want to add on to the pile here, Shane. I don't. But the problem is
I'm saying that Gog and Magog is here. Yeah, go.
I also read this stuff. I go to these events and I talk to a lot of people. When you think about the Redoubt movement is in the Pacific Northwest. It's a group of people who are trying to literally separate from the U.S., who want to form their own country. They tried in Oregon to expand, they tried in Idaho to expand the territorial lines into Oregon, calling it a new state. These are people, and there's documentaries on these folks. They are armed and they are just waiting for a civil war. When I went to America Fest, hosted by Turning Point USA, they have this thing called, it's not the alternate economy. It's essentially they're building a different economy by saying, don't shop here, shop at these Patriot-owned businesses. And because when everything collapses, we're going to need our own infrastructure. So don't process payments through PayPal because they're woke. Go here instead. Don't get your healthcare from here. Get it from here instead. Don't buy Starbucks. Buy Patriot coffee because it's a whole thing. I actually covered it on our I actually covered it on YouTube. I did a full hour-long recap of my time at America Fest, and I talked for almost 15 minutes about this alternate economy that people are trying to build. And it's not that I hope we have violence. I don't want violence. I hope that in 5 years, 10 years, people look back at this interview at this point and go, oh, those guys were exaggerating. Yeah. I don't want any of this stuff to come true or to happen. But when you think about January 6th, when you think about some of the data on Christian nationalism, when you think about how Trump is still pushing a stolen election narrative and how there are people in his base who are militant about protecting the country from the deep state, aka anyone who's a Democrat, like Joe Biden. I mean, there are pundits I hear that say Joe Biden is the most radical president to ever exist. I'm like, that man is a moderate. That man couldn't even get student loan forgiveness passed. Like, don't tell me he's a radical Marxist. Like, what are we actually talking about here?
Yeah.
So I think between that and between the corporate meddling with all the money inside the election process and the lobbying, I just feel like the pressure cooker is at a new level of pressure. And we need to find a relief valve before this thing goes kablooey, and we have another January 6th or something like that has even more violence, more bloodshed. Again, I want to be wrong. I hope I'm wrong. I hope nothing ever happens. But you're right. You look at what's happening in the country and you go, man, we are at another moment of the wave has crested, and which way are we going to go?
Yeah, and that's where I look to some of those movements that have been rooted in faith, but also in resistance.
Yes.
Like Dr. King, when he says that the church is not meant to be the master of the state or the servant of the state. The church is meant to be the conscience.
Yeah.
Right? What does it look like to be the moral conscience? As Reverend Barber says, we're to be like the defibrillator, the shock people back to life and love and compassion, to wake people up and say, this is not okay, right?
Right.
And
totally.
That the test for how healthy our nation is not how the Dow Jones is doing, but how the poor are doing. And I think those movements have a lot to show us about how we should posture ourselves right now. Like, and one of the questions is, like, when that scripture says that perfect love casteth out fear, so much of what is driving the American political imagination is fear.
Yes.
Fear of
totally.
other people, fear of scarcity. They're going to take our jobs, they're going to attack us. Like, got to have guns to protect all that stuff is fear driven. And so if we really believe that love casteth out fear, that these are like opposing magnets, that we have to choose between love and fear, that's one of the questions that I think we can ask is, what would our country look like if love was the framework that we're thinking about voting, that we're thinking about policies, whether it's guns or immigration or the death penalty or militarism? Like, what does love look like?
Right.
That seems like a really beautiful way to think about stuff.
I often tell people that, hey, if Christian nationalists wanted affordable health care and want to take care of the poor and call it a Christian country, I'd be like, okay, I can get behind that. That's pretty attractive, but it's not, right? I mean, it is interesting, again, to your point, Matthew 25, there are so many passages in Scripture, which many evangelicals and Christians claim to take so seriously, that advocate for things that are, I would argue nowadays, common sense. I think it is truly an injustice that in the world's richest country, we can't get affordable healthcare for all of our citizens. I mean, I still personally worry about some surprise medical bill in the mail or something not being covered, or I'm out of network or something. But we know other countries don't have that issue, And so that's not to make it seem like there's always a perfect solution, but there are certainly better alternatives. And it's frustrating to watch Christians in the political sphere seemingly to always be fighting against this stuff, whether during Obama's tenure, when he was trying to get affordable health care passed, he was resisted every step of the way, or every now and then some Christian politician in some state goes viral for saying, no, we should reduce free lunches for kids, or whatever it is. And I look at that and I go, we've just lost our way, I think, as Christians, because you're right. We want to be the conscience of the state, or the salt of the world, as Jesus says, right? And when we're not known for being empathetic and fighting for the least of these, and thinking about, we have so much wealth here in the U.S., for much of it because of, granted, injustices that we've committed around the world, or how we pillage other countries for their minerals. I think that's all very fair things, and we should acknowledge that. But regardless, the wealth is here. And to see it being distributed more and more to like the 1%, right? While the majority of Americans can't even put food on, or they're struggling to put food on the table, or, housing is so unaffordable. Or, I mean, even think about the American dream I was sold by listening to Sean Hannity. If you work hard, you can make it. Many Americans are working 40, 50, 60 hours a week and still can't survive, right? The promise is broken. And then when we talk about potential solutions or ways to fix it, I'm not sure about you, but I get called a Marxist, a socialist, godless, or something like that. And he goes, I'm not talking about Marxism or socialism. I'm talking about we can do this. If we can fund our military more and more every year, and we can keep making arms that can reach to the far ends of the world, and we can shoot rockets into space, certainly we can fund affordable education, affordable housing, more safety nets for folks who really need it, affordable access to healthcare, paid family leave. These are not ridiculous asks, but for some reason in my tradition, they came across as like, no, we can't do that because Marxism. It's like, this is not a good enough answer for me. I'm sorry.
No, I know. I mean, you look at the Gospel of Luke, and it begins with that beautiful song of Mary. It's this pronouncement of the mighty will be cast from their thrones, the lowly will be lifted up. And then it says the hungry will be filled and the rich will be sent away empty. That's not Karl Marx. That's
Marxism alert.
Gospel of Luke, man.
Right.
And I mean, Jesus is the last will be first, the first will be last. Like it's all about a reorientation of what's been called the upside down kingdom, but it's really setting things right. You go, this is the kind of world that God imagined and dreams and wants for us, and it's a world where one person's sustenance doesn't mean another person's suffering. Right? Like as Gandhi said, there's enough for everyone's need, but not enough for everyone's greed. I literally think that part of what we're praying every day, this day our daily bread, as we look at the scripture, it's a vision that there is enough. God didn't mess up and make too many people or not enough resources. But we have so concentrated wealth and poverty that, I mean, I've even had to change this stat, Tim, as I've written books over 20 years. And it's now like, it used to be, 1,000 people own the same amount as half the world. It's now like less than 50 billionaires and millionaires that own the same amount as 3.5 billion people in the world.
Wow.
That's unimaginable. I mean, you really can't imagine.
Right.
Like if you look what Elon Musk and makes in a second, like second, a minute, and to think actually that is what's crazy.
Yeah.
Right. Like it's not crazy to imagine a world where people have food and people don't die because they don't have a mosquito net that costs $3, right? It's crazy to imagine that we think the world will be safe when a handful of people have unfathomable wealth
Yeah.
at the exact moment that other people are starving to death.
Yeah.
Like that's an unstable, unsafe world for everybody, you know? And, so I think it's a beautiful time to reimagine the world. And the great thing about the youthful energy that's out there is they're calling it, you know, they're
Yeah.
going like, nah, we're done with the excuses.
Totally.
Like we're done with the rhetoric around gun control and like all
Right.
that, like whatever it is, whatever the politicians have made excuses for and the preachers have offered thoughts and prayers while doing nothing, like they're done with that.
Yeah.
You know, lives are at stake, and that's why people
100%.
are in the streets. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked a lot about the overarching theme I had in my head talking to you was life. Just how do we think about life broadly, quality of life, protecting life, etc. I think you've offered just so many thought-provoking ways for us to navigate, especially as Christians. What do we do in a very volatile time with all these different things going on? I think that's good. I think one of my last questions to get your thoughts on is a lot of us are just very uncomfortable. I think it's a good word, where we look around and we're like, I feel awkward. I don't know how to navigate some of this stuff. I feel helpless. I mean, Shane, I've seen too many videos of deceased children on my phone through Instagram in the Gaza Strip. And it makes me go, well, I can't do anything about this. Like, do I pray? Like, what do I do? Right. And I think a lot of people are kind of in that spot where they know about all the issues. They see what's going on. They go, what can I do to be part of the change that we want to see? And if there's anyone to ask, I feel like it's you, because you are someone who really, your day job is not being in an office, you know, studying the book of Mark on a theological, scholarly level. You're someone who's in the streets, working with people, marching, building coalitions to make the world better. For people who might have families, jobs, who can't be someone who's able to go on a whim to a protest or something, what are some practical ways that people watching can get involved or be part of the change tangibly to make the world better?
I really like that there's this little passage in Romans that says we're not to conform to the pattern of this world, but to be transformed. And then it says by the renewing of our mind, like we're to live with a different imagination. And I look at a lot of the great prophets. They were folks that were wild. They were doing funky things. And they also got in trouble. They went to jail. They got killed. Dr. King, you know, when he was accused of being maladjusted, he really embraced that term. You know, and he said, there are some things we shouldn't be adjusted to, you know?
Yeah, right.
And he said, we need some holy maladjusted people. So I think that's one of the questions is what does it look like to embrace the idea that we're not settling for the way things are right now. And you know, old Peter Morin of the Catholic Worker Movement, he said, if I'm crazy, it's because I refuse to be crazy in the same way that the world's gone crazy. So like looking at this accumulation of wealth and saying we're not going to do that, I think there's all kinds of creative ways that people can be maladjusted and that they can challenge the systems.
Yeah.
There's ways that we can divest, that we can rethink our finances, that we can ask the fundamental question of Scripture. What does it look like to love my neighbor as myself?
Right.
So I see folks that are creating scholarships for kids that aren't theirs, you know, to match the scholarship fund for their own kids. I see folks that are challenging their institutions to divest from the military, you know, the complicity with violence that's happening around the world. I think it's less of an anecdote and more of a invitation to live differently, like to imagine a world that's different from the one that is, and not to allow like the poverty to become normal, not to allow violence to be our default mechanism, and to go, no, that's it doesn't have to be that way. You know,
Right.
that's what I think is really in that idea that we're not to conform. And at times that's segregation, you know, like that meant like we're not going to live in a racially segregated society. It's hard for people to imagine outside of that.
Right.
Mandela said before every social movement that's changed the world, people said it's impossible. And after every social movement that changed the world, people look back and say it was inevitable. But it's not inevitable. History doesn't just happen. History's made. And I think that's where we've got to ask the question of what does it look like to participate in that? I really think that a generation from now, I mean, even now, we don't have to wait. People are asking, like, what were you doing when Gaza was,
Right.
when there was a genocide in Gaza?
Right.
Like, there's other times where we had less tools in our toolbox where we could say we didn't know. We can't say that now, so let's not look back and wonder what we might have done differently. Let's do stuff now, and I think you're right in pointing out things are imperfect. Protests are imperfect. There are folks that, as much as we discipline ourselves in love and tenderness and nonviolence, there are folks that are angry, and sometimes that anger expresses itself in unhelpful or even hateful ways, and we never justify that.
Right.
But I think Dr. King had the exact same thing. I mean, there were also groups being infiltrated deliberately, right?
Yeah, we know that. Mm-hmm.
But there was an anger that Dr. King said, riot is the language of the unheard.
Yes.
And that often gets really, that little line gets taken out of context. But I think Dr. King was naming the fact that when people when they don't feel heard, they shout louder.
Yeah.
And there's a desperation that we see, I think, in Gaza and in all kinds of places where people need to, all they're saying is, we can't breathe.
Yeah.
Like, do you care about us? And the more we try to put our hands over our ears, they're going to shout louder. And Dr. King also said, we're quick to denounce the violence of protests. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but he said, we don't always call out the conditions that led to that protest.
100%.
So let's not just react when there's a riot or there's someone shouting violent language. I mean, we can certainly keep ourselves grounded in love, but let's also look at the conditions that are fueling people's pain.
Yeah.
And I think that's even true for the folks that follow Trump.
Yep.
Like, what is it that has created this magnetism to him?
Yep.
And there were times where, a few years ago, we used to say, Trump didn't change America, he revealed America.
Yeah.
There's still a part of that that's true, but I think that this is bigger than Trump, and the principalities and powers that have been unleashed over the last few years, they do potentially have the power to change America. I mean, you even look at the Supreme Court and things that are happening right now.
Yeah.
I think God is big, but I also think that God has chosen to have us as the body of Christ, in the world. And so God doesn't just act in a vacuum, but God's inviting us to kind of step up, to pursue the kind of world that God wants. And so let's do it.
I love how I think for a lot of people, you really reframed the passage that says, do not be conformed to the pattern of this world. Because a lot of people hear that and they go, oh yeah, I was taught that meant don't curse or, whatever it might be. But you're like, no. I believe this even in context. We're talking about this upside down kingdom, right? The world says the powerful are first. It's, being meek and mild is not the way to do it. The more you have, the better off you are. Might makes right kind of vibe. But the ethic of Jesus, or, not being conformed to the pattern of this world, is thinking about, as you said many times, being smaller and smaller until we take over the world. The idea of like radical little groups that are infiltrating neighborhoods for positive change, loving their neighbors everywhere, and then fighting together with their marginalized neighbor to think about a better way forward. And I think that's such a beautiful, for me as a Christian, that's part of what makes me so attracted to the Christian message. I love the rebel, upside down kingdom ethic of, no, like there's a better way forward than what we see now. And we can find that in the way of Christ and working with other people of all different faiths to make that reality. So,
I think part of why we get along so much is that there are some things that I don't want to give those that have tried to hijack the Christian faith that much power.
Right.
So there's a difference between deconstructing and decolonizing, like taking Jesus back and not allowing Jesus to be hijacked. And some of these texts, I think we got to do that. The don't conform. There's a radical anti-imperial message all through the life of Jesus in the text, even the Hebrew scriptures. But I think of even things like, we're sanctuaries. You know, we sing that old song, Lord, prepare me. I won't do it to you. But,
I'm triggered, Shane.
Be a sanctuary, pure and holy, right? But,
for real.
that's not just about not smoking and chewing tobacco or something like. I think that's like, there's a part of this idea that Jesus literally saying that you are the temples, like the kingdom lives within you. Like I live within you. Like there's this sense of like, wow, how much more sacred does it get than that?
Yeah.
Like human beings are actually, it's not these buildings that God lives in, but God's spirit lives in us. I mean that should recalibrate everything as we think of human life and how precious it is, and whose lives are at stake right now. And, and I think that's part of the challenge of the ideas when it comes to like all lives matter is let's talk about the lives that have been crushed.
Yes.
You know, because that's exactly what Scripture says now is that if one part of the body suffers, we all suffer.
Yeah.
And if one part has been dehumanized, God gives special honor to the parts of the body that have been dishonored. So to be able to emphatically say, like, Palestinian lives matter.
Right.
It's not that hard, right? And we can't say all lives matter until we can say Black lives matter, you know, that Native lives matter, and that God cares just as much about the kids in Gaza as the kids in Jerusalem.
100%. Shane, you were my first guest ever in studio.
Loving it, dude.
It was awesome, man. I appreciate you making time. It's great seeing you. If folks want to follow your work online, where can they find you?
They can find all of us at redletterchristians.org. I'm also,
love that.
You know, on the socials, just my name, Shane Claiborne. And with your help, I'm learning to do reels.
Happy to help anytime, my brother. Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks again for being here. It means a lot.
Totally.
Sweet. Boom, baby. We did it.
Did we get to everything you wanted to?